The Chasm and the Collision by Robert Alessar. Copyright 2017 by Robert Alessar. All rights reserved. Any reproduction of this copyrighted material by any means without the express written consent of the author is strictly prohibited. For Jacob and Kira, all the way. Chapter 5. Peetry. Unfortunately, now that Simon and Megan were gone, Alex was left alone in his house with the mystery behind the dining room curtain. And after what Simon had said just before leaving, Alex was not nearly as intrigued by it as he had been before. Instead of thinking of it as a strange but fascinating phenomenon, possibly related to the dreams they had all been having, now he had the misgiving that it might really be some sinister trap. It hadn't closed around his wrist moments ago, but perhaps that was because it wanted more than just his hand. The apple had gone through. It certainly hadn't come back. What if Alex got too close, tripped, and fell all the way through the wall? Or what if something reached out through the wall and pulled him in? Maybe a reptilian hand, or the prehensile tail of some flying monstrosity that had decided to take a more direct approach to finding what it wanted. What if he were sitting at the table and suddenly felt something wrap around his ankle, something that would drag him, scratching and screaming, through the wall to whatever was on the other side? "That's stupid," he said out loud, but he did not fully convince himself. He decided not to go back into the dining room while alone in the house. He also decided that, despite Simon's early protests, he wasn't happy with how dark the front of the house was. He turned on the front hallway light, then, walking into the family room, he turned on the lamp next to his father's easy chair. Satisfied for the moment, he stood and stared into the dining room, watching the left-hand curtain. It was still and silent, just like normal, but Alex couldn't help thinking about what he, Simon, and Megan had seen behind it. What had happened to the apple? Was it still in one piece somewhere, floating in space or lying on the surface of an alien planet? Was it someplace else on Earth? Or had it completely disintegrated once it had gone through the wall? Shuddering, Alex thought that even with the lights on, he didn't want to be so close to the dining room while no one else was home. He felt hungry, and he considered taking the long way around to the kitchen to get a snack, but the kitchen was right next to the dining room. Deciding that he could wait to eat until his mother got home, he went back into the front hall, picked up his book bag, and went up to his bedroom. He turned on the lights, left his curtains closed, and shut the door before throwing his bag and himself onto his bed. He still wore his jacket, and his legs dangled off the edge of the mattress, while he looked up at the ceiling and waited impatiently for the sound of his mother's car. When Mrs. Hinton did arrive home later that afternoon, Alex eagerly went downstairs to greet her at the door, swinging it wide as though he were the butler of a mansion and she an honored guest. She looked surprised and happy at the enthusiasm of his greeting, and as she took off her jacket and hung it in the hall closet, she asked Alex how his day had been. Alex, of course, told her nothing about the 2-man and 3 dinosaur dogs, and he also didn't mention anything about the dining room wall, though whenever it was in his field of vision for the rest of the evening, he kept at least part of his attention on it. Not too long after she had gotten home, Alex's mother asked him if he wouldn't mind once again raking the tree buds up off the lawn. There weren't as many as there had been 2 days ago, but they had still accumulated into a moderate covering. Alex's stomach plummeted. Though his mother had phrased the task as a request, he knew that he didn't truly have the option to refuse. He tried to think of an excuse, but nothing came to him. He certainly couldn't tell her the truth, that he was afraid the dinosaur dogs might still be about. He considered using some variation of Simon's story that had convinced Mrs. Belmont to drive him and Megan home, but so long after school had let out, it would be absurd still to be frightened by a fight. In any case, the street was plainly quiet and peaceful. Resigning himself, Alex crept out through the back door, looking to his left and right constantly, his head raised and his eyes wide. As he opened the garage to get the rake, he thought of a documentary program he had once seen in which a young antelope had gotten separated from its herd somewhere in Africa. He felt a bit the way that poor animal had looked, twitchy and hyper-alert, wondering if at any moment a predator was going to leap from cover and give chase. He was especially nervous as he walked into the front yard and looked up and down the block. Much to his relief, All he saw were the ordinary sights of a suburban street. Neighbors arriving home from work, a few younger children playing in yards here and there, cars passing at intervals in both directions. The sky was an almost pristine blue, and a faint breeze tugged occasional buds off tree branches. It all seemed positively idyllic, and Alex found himself relaxing just a bit. He finished raking the lawn much more quickly alone than he had the other day when he and Simon had done the job together. This was partly because there were fewer of the buds, but mostly it was because Alex drove himself at a manic pace, trying to finish the job and get back inside as quickly as possible. When he did come in, having collected and bagged all the fruits of his labor, his mother expressed surprise that he was already finished. She looked out through the front windows. She had reopened both sets of drapes and turned out the lights, and saw that the job had been done to her satisfaction. As his mother prepared dinner, Alex sat at the dining room table doing his homework at the opposite end from the window, where he could keep an eye on the wall and the curtains. He saw not a single untoward twitch or rustle in the fabric that covered the strange oval in the wall. When he looked up from an assignment, deep in thought, Alex's eyes fell on the wooden fruit bowl, and he thought about Simon's genetically modified fruit hypothesis. "Oh, hey, Mom," he called out. "I was wondering, where did you get those berries we had the other day?" His mother absent-mindedly responded, "Which berries were those, sweetie?" Alex rolled his eyes at the charm of endearment, wishing his mother would at least confine its use to bedtime. Then he said, "The ones from the other day. I told you how much I liked them." Now his mother came to the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, looking at Alex with a puzzled expression. "Which berries were those?" she asked again. "Those reddish-purple ones," Alex told her. They looked a little like strawberries. They were on a stalk with 3 branches." Alex's mother continued to look at him. She shook her head and said, "I'm not sure what you mean. I didn't get any berries recently." Alex felt a shiver go down his spine, and he said, But they were in the fruit bowl 2 days ago when I got home from school. Me and Simon ate them, and I gave some to Megan." "Who's Megan?" his mother asked, looking confused. "She's this girl from school. She walks past our house on her way home. Anyway, all 3 of us ate those berries. I threw the stems in the kitchen trash. Didn't you see them?" Mrs. Hinton shook her head and said, "I don't make a habit of rooting through the trash to see what's been thrown away." Alex felt rather crestfallen. But you didn't get any berries?" he said. "Nothing that looked kind of like strawberries?" Shaking her head again, his mother replied, "No, I'm afraid I didn't. I just got the things I usually get." She looked at the bowl, which held the remaining apples as well as the bananas and tangerines, none of which Alex usually ate. Alex half expected her to notice the absence of one of the apples and to congratulate him for eating it, which would be embarrassing given what had really happened to it. His mother, however, said nothing about the bowl's missing occupant, and Alex himself was far more concerned with entirely different fruit. "But they were there," he insisted. "They smelled great and tasted better. Me and Simon and Megan ate all of them." "I don't know," his mother said, looking vastly unconcerned. "Maybe your father got them from somewhere at the office and he decided to put them in the fruit bowl." With that, she turned and went back into the kitchen. "Yeah," Alex muttered. "Maybe." His mother's explanation didn't seem right to him, though. Why would someone at his father's office give away fruit? His father didn't work in a business that had anything to do with food or agriculture. Alex supposed that maybe one of his father's co-workers had gone to a farmer's market at lunch or something along those lines and had found the delicious berries and decided to share them with colleagues. But if so, when had his father brought them into the house? Now that he thought about it, Alex wondered when even his mother could have brought the berries inside. Thinking back, he was all but certain that they hadn't been there when he'd left for school on Tuesday morning. They had been there when he'd come home. His mother could have stopped at the store and swung by the house on her lunch hour, but he didn't know why she would have done such a thing. In any case, she said she hadn't bought the berries, had never even seen them. Alex was quite sure that she would have remembered it if she had, especially once she'd smelled them. Now Simon's hypothesis about the berries being connected to the dreams rose to greater prominence in Alex's mind, and he began to suspect that their presence was just as mysterious as had been that of the flying manta ray and the dinosaur dogs. But he had no idea in what way they were all connected. If the berries had made the shared dreams happen, then what made the berries happen? It all seemed to point toward the dreams and the creatures being not quite all the way linked, but he was far from being sure or clear on the matter. It was too confusing and too frightening. He decided that he needed to talk to Simon. "Mom," he said, "is it okay if I take the phone to my room? I want to call Simon about a homework assignment we've got." "Sure thing, sweetie," his mother's distracted voice called back from the kitchen. "Just make sure to put it back on the charger when you're done." Alex grabbed the phone and headed upstairs, not thinking to bring his backpack or books with him to maintain the fiction of the phone call's purpose. Once he was in his room, he closed the door and dialed Simon's number. After 4 rings, the phone picked up and a pleasant voice said, "Hello?" Recognizing the voice, Alex said, "Hi, Mrs. Belmont, it's Alex. Can I talk to Simon?" "You sure can," she replied. "Hang on just a minute." A relative silence followed on the other end of the line for a moment, then a clattering noise, then Simon's voice said, "Hi, Alex, what's up?" Alex thought Simon sounded perfectly normal and happy, and he felt slightly guilty about what he was about to say. "Hey, Simon," he said, "are you where you can talk without anyone hearing?" No," Simon answered. "Should I be?" "Well, I think you'll want to be." "Why?" Simon asked. With a sigh, Alex said, "Because my mom didn't buy those berries we had the other day, and she doesn't know anything about them." After a moment, Simon said, "Hang on, I'm going to go to my room." "Good idea," Alex agreed, though he doubted that Simon could hear him since noises of movement now carried through the phone. These were followed by muffled footsteps, which were no doubt the sounds of Simon going upstairs. Soon Alex heard a door open and close, and then Simon asked, "Okay, what did you say about the berries?" "I said that my mom says she didn't buy them. When I asked her about them, she didn't even know what I was talking about. She said she hadn't bought any berries of any kind in a long time." But then, did your dad get them?" Simon asked. "I doubt it," Alex said. "My dad usually leaves before my mom and gets home later. And no, I didn't see him bring them in, so unless he snuck home at lunch to put them in the fruit bowl, I don't think it was him." "But then, who did put them there? How did they get there?" "I don't know," Alex admitted. "That's why I'm calling you." A moment of silence followed, and Alex could imagine the thoughtful expression on Simon's face as he considered the problem. When he spoke again, Simon sounded both frustrated and confused. "I don't know either," he said. "It's crazy. I mean, how the heck could berries just show up in your fruit bowl all by themselves?" "I don't know," Alex said again. "But I think it means that they can't have caused any of this, can they have? Not if they're just as weird as the manta thing and the dinosaur dogs." Simon said slowly, I'm not sure. I still feel like there's something different about them, and I'm not sure what." Alex was frustrated by Simon's inability to figure out the answer instantly, but he knew this was very unfair, so he kept quiet and allowed Simon to think. Half mumbling, Simon said, "We've had the dreams 2 nights in a row. We heard that flying thing, and you saw it. And we all saw those, those dinosaur dogs, and the men with him that nobody else could see. And now it seems like the berries were something that shouldn't have been there. And then there's that space warp or whatever in your dining room wall." "Yeah," Alex agreed, waiting to see if Simon would find some common denominator. As if trying to live up to Alex's hopes, Simon suddenly said, "Hey, what if the berries came through that thing in your wall?" "Huh?" Alex said. "Well, Megan threw an apple into it, right?" Simon elaborated. "So what if the berries came out of it?" "What, you mean like some sort of trade?" Alex asked incredulously. "No," Simon fussed. "How could it be a trade if the berries came through 2 days before Megan threw the apple in it? I just mean that, I don't know, maybe those berries got through it from the other side." Simon sounded dubious himself as he explained his suggestion, and Alex found the idea unconvincing. "I don't know," he said. "How could they have come through and landed right in our fruit bowl? They'd have had to get past the curtain." "Yeah," Simon admitted. "That would be pretty tough. But hey," he added, his tone becoming more forceful, "maybe somebody brought them through. Maybe somebody brought them through and put them in the fruit bowl." "Brought them from where?" Alex asked, far from sure that Simon's idea made any sense. "I don't know," Simon replied. "From wherever's on the other side of the wall. from wherever those lizards and that flying thing come from. Remember, you thought you saw that curtain moving on Tuesday when we got to your house, right? Alex felt like slapping himself on the forehead. You're right, he exclaimed. I forgot all about that. Maybe someone did come through that thing and put the berries there. Yeah, maybe they did, Simon said. But why would someone do that, if they did? He sounded as though he doubted his own proposal. I don't know, Alex said yet again. Why is any of this happening? Good question, Simon conceded. After a moment, he went on. Look, I gotta think about this some more. Can you do me a favor? Sure, Alex replied. Can you leave 15 minutes or so earlier than usual tomorrow and come to my house? Yeah, Alex said, but why? Well, I'm going to call Megan when I get off the phone with you. You know Megan's phone number? Alex interrupted, instantly distracted and envious. Obviously, Simon replied impatiently. Anyway, I want you and me to go to her house, and we can all walk to school together. Really? Alex asked, so excited about the prospect of seeing where Megan lived and walking to school with her that he was momentarily distracted from the remarkable things he and Simon had been discussing. Yeah, Simon said, still impatient. Really. I figure we'll have longer to talk and more privacy that way than we would if we were all sitting in a homeroom together. And hopefully we can all keep an eye out for those lizard things. I feel like we'll be safer together than we would be by ourselves. Alex hadn't considered the notion of walking to school the next day after what he, Simon, and Megan had encountered that afternoon. Now that he thought about it, he agreed that it would be much more comforting to go in a group than it would be for him to go by himself. Although, what even the three of them together might do to protect themselves from men and dinosaur dogs, other than running again, he wasn't sure. Okay, he agreed. I'll be at your house in the morning. Cool, Simon said. I'll call Megan and let her know. I don't know if she'll want us going up to her house to meet her or what, but I'll find out. And then tomorrow we can talk more about everything. Right. Sounds great, Alex said, thinking particularly about the prospect of learning more about Megan. The other matters weren't quite as much fun to imagine, though he had to admit to himself that they were gripping. And make sure to pay attention to any dreams you have tonight, Simon told him. Right, Alex said again. Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Simon. Sure, yeah, no problem, Simon responded, clearly wondering what he had done that merited thanks. All right, I'll see you tomorrow, Alex said. Right, Simon replied. Bye. Alex heard Simon's line disconnect, and he shut off his phone as well. He sat in his bed for a moment, trying to process what he and Simon had discussed. Could someone really have come into the dining room on Tuesday and left the berries in the fruit bowl? It seemed crazy, but not any crazier than anything else that had happened. It was disquieting to think of someone walking out of the dining room wall into his house and roaming around uninvited. It was, in a way, more disturbing than the thought of the dinosaur dogs getting into his house had been, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was because the dinosaur dogs seemed somehow innocent and benign. One had even commented on how nice babies smelled. A person walking through the house, however, that seemed far more sinister. Those thoughts led Alex to recall the noises he had heard the night before. Had those been the sounds of someone from that space warp, as Simon had called it? If so, was it the person who had left the berries, or someone different? Or was it not a person at all? It hadn't sounded alien to Alex. He had thought the noises had been made by his mother. He hadn't been frightened at all when he had gone downstairs. Of course, Simon would probably say that he ought to have been frightened, but Alex thought that Simon got scared too easily. Deciding that his speculations weren't getting him anywhere, Alex left his bedroom. He went downstairs to the family room and put the phone back on its charger, then went back to his homework, having difficulty concentrating because of all the strange ideas flying through his head. Really, what in the world was going on? Why, all of a sudden, were he, Simon, and Megan experiencing such bizarre things? When the week had begun, it had been a perfectly ordinary, rather nice springtime school week. The most stressful concern for Alex had been the fact that Megan didn't seem to know he existed, but even that had been ameliorated when on Monday they had been placed in the same Crucible discussion group. Now things were all topsy-turvy, and though Megan certainly knew who he was, she hadn't gotten to know him under the most comforting of circumstances. Their current mutual concerns were hardly conducive to ease and friendliness, let alone to anything romantic. Alex tried to clear those thoughts from his mind and return to his homework, but even as he did, his mother asked him to set their 2 places at the table because dinner was ready. He gratefully accepted the distraction, but even as he obeyed her, he watched the left dining room curtain carefully. There was not the slightest sign of movement, which was good, but he was still very happy that his seat was on the opposite side of the table. As he ate, he kept glancing from the motionless curtain to his mother, who was only a few feet away from the material, blissfully unaware that, in the wall near her, was an inexplicable phenomenon, perhaps a space warp if Simon was correct. What was on the other side of that strange oval, if there even was an other side? He had no idea, but he was far from certain that even his mother was completely safe sitting so close to it, and he was deeply relieved when she finished her dinner and got up from the table. He followed her into the kitchen happily, eager to help clean up. He was determined to sit and do his homework at the table when his father got home, so he could keep an eye on the curtain. His father, sitting at the head of the table, would have his back practically right up against the wall, and he was, if anything, even more oblivious than his spouse. That night, Alex's mother shut off his bedroom light and said good night without disturbing his sleep, because he was very much wide awake. His father's dinner had passed without incident, and Alex had just barely been able to finish his homework before bedtime. He was powerfully distracted, as his mother had noticed and noted, and had a much more difficult time concentrating even than on the previous evening. Now, lying in bed in his darkened room, his curtains still deliberately left closed, Alex had trouble relaxing as he thought of the coming night and the following morning. Though last night's dream had been far from frightening, and even the one from Tuesday night had been more startling than scary, he was nervous about what might happen once he fell asleep. Would he see the garden again? Would he see the impossible fortress city hanging over the edge of the seemingly bottomless cliff? Or would he see something new, something stranger still? He wasn't sure if he wanted to find out. For once, his curiosity didn't readily overcome his unease. He was nervous about the next morning, too, both in good and bad ways. He was enthusiastic about seeing where Megan lived, of course, as well as about walking to school with her. He was also eager to discuss whatever ideas might come to Simon overnight. But he was quite anxious about the possibility of encountering more of those men and dinosaur dogs. What would they do if that happened? What if they saw something even more bizarre? Alex thought about bringing something with him that might serve as a tool of self-defense. He couldn't bring a real weapon like a knife from the kitchen, but maybe he could look around for a good-sized stick or something. Or maybe he could bring a baseball bat. He had one in the garage. He wondered whether his mother would let him carry it to school if he said he was going to take part in an after-school game. He didn't think he'd get in trouble for having a bat at school, as long as he put it in his locker once he got there and only took it out when he was leaving. That might work. He was no major slugger or anything, but he thought that a baseball bat could be pretty intimidating nevertheless. Reassured slightly, he began to relax at last. It occurred to him that he might not even really have to ask his mother about the bat. Friday was a trash pickup day. He could take out the garbage in the morning, and while he was in the garage, grab the bat, put it by the front door, and pick it up when he left to meet Simon and Megan. Yeah, that could work. Smiling at the simplicity and cleverness of his idea, he began to drift off to sleep. Alex felt what he thought might be the beginning of a dream in which he found himself floating in darkness. It was warm and strangely comfortable, but he could see nothing at all. He was slightly groggy, but he was unusually self-aware. "My child." Alex started. He thought he heard a voice, very distant, very soft, and quite pleasant. "Go, my child." No, it wasn't a voice, not exactly. The words weren't truly spoken words. He was in fact not hearing them because they weren't sounds. They were simply thoughts, ideas that his brain translated into speech. "Awaken and go, my child. Go to him." "Hello?" Alex asked aloud, startled that he could hear his own voice. "Hello," the non-voice replied. Again surprised, this time by the polite reply, Alex asked, "Who is this? Who are you?" "You have seen me before," the voice answered. "Very briefly, more than once. I am far from you now." "Where?" Alex asked. "What's your name? What's going on?" "It cannot be explained now," came the reply. You will understand all things soon, but now there is no time and it is too difficult. Please, my child, awaken and go downstairs to him. He is distraught and terrified. Please reassure him." "Look, I don't know what the heck you're talking about," Alex said, still seeing nothing but pitch blackness, hearing no actual sound other than that of his own voice. "I know, and I apologize," the voice said, or made him understand. "All will become clear soon, but for now please go to him. Tell him what has happened. Tell him that I said it is what I hoped would happen." "Tell what? Tell who?" Alex asked. He then felt the strange, rococo stream of input flow into his mind as the voice tried to give him the impression of a person not using visual or verbal means. They were peculiar sensations, messages received via senses which Alex didn't possess. He felt his brain itching and crawling as it tried to process information for which it was not designed, and he cried out in alarm. The non-voice pulled back in apparent rueful embarrassment, and the strange, impossible impression left Alex, much to his relief. "My sincere apologies," the voice said. "I forgot that you are not yet quite as I am." No problem," Alex replied weakly. "The one to whom I ask you to go would call himself Peetry." "Peetry?" Alex asked. He wasn't sure he had understood correctly, because this time the non-voice had tried to convey actual sounds to him, and this clearly was not a usual task for it. "Yes," came the reply. "Go to him now, please. He is in great distress. Tell him that he has done very well." "Go where?" Alex wondered. "What do you mean?" "Go downstairs," he was told. "He is there now and frightened. Please tell him from me that all is well. Tell him what has happened." "I don't understand what you're talking about," Alex said. "You will." Who are you?" Alex asked. "I mean, if I'm supposed to tell Peetry that you told me something, then, well, I mean, who are you?" "He will know," the non-voice assured him. "Now, please, my child, awaken and go." "But, please, awaken and go." And Alex woke up. Unlike the previous night, he knew immediately where he was when he opened his eyes. He was in his darkened bedroom, and he had just awakened from another strange dream. Only this one didn't seem to have been a dream. He hadn't been fully awake when it happened, but neither had he been fully unconscious. He had instead been in a kind of trance, as if hypnotized. He didn't feel confused or groggy now, as he might have if he'd been asleep, and because of the things that the non-voice had told him, he had a fairly clear idea of what he should do. He got out of bed and walked to his bedroom door, opening it slowly and quietly, not wanting to take a chance of disturbing his parents. A quick peek assured him that they hadn't left their door open, and he swung his own door wide with a bit more confidence. He stepped out into the hallway and listened briefly to the sound of his father's snoring before heading for the stairs. He did not give more than an instant's thought to refusing to obey the non-voice from his not-quite dream. He had received more than just verbal ideas when it had spoken to him. He had also felt the thought and intentions behind the words. There had been no ill will, no deception whatsoever, only a pleasant, almost sad benignity. He had felt the voice's sympathy and concern for whoever Peetry was, and he intended to try to deliver its message. He also knew where Peetry could be found. Peetry was downstairs, in his house. He listened. He wasn't sure, but he thought he heard stealthy and careful movements, as well as an occasional whisper coming from downstairs, but he could have been imagining them. The noises were faint, nothing like the thuds and muttered imprecations from the night before. Whatever the case, he didn't doubt that someone was down there, and he did not for a moment consider not going to meet them. He felt no fear as he padded noiselessly down the stairs, but not for the same reason as the night before. Then he had simply been too groggy and confused, too half asleep, to sense or imagine any potential danger. Now he was quite alert, but through the assurance of the non-voice he felt safe. The person downstairs was not a threat to him. At least, that was what the non-voice sincerely believed. Alex supposed it could be mistaken, but for some reason he trusted his judgment. Perhaps that was foolish. Simon would certainly have said so, but Alex felt confident as he stepped off the last step and walked into the family room. As usual, all the curtains were open, and after the almost pitch blackness of his bedroom, Alex found that he could see quite well in the ambient light from the street. He had no trouble making out the sofa and chairs in the family room, the table and chairs in the dining room, or the slender figure facing away from him, also in the dining room. Its hands were holding the sides of its head as though trying to keep it from flying to pieces, and it seemed to be staring at the surface of the table. Alex heard a whispered question, barely audible. "Where is it?" it said in a voice near tears. "Where can it be?" Alex, still not frightened, and feeling that he'd better say something before just walking up to this person, quietly said, "Peetry?" The figure jumped almost a foot straight up, then whirled, facing Alex and stumbling backward at the same time, bumping against the chair at the end of the table. Alex saw that the person in the dining room was young. Not as young as he was, but not as old as his parents. Peetry was also taller than Alex. Taller than Simon, too, by quite a bit, and maybe as tall as Alex's mother, but not as tall as his father, though his or her slight frame gave the impression of height. Alex couldn't see very clearly in the dim light, but he could tell that the person's face looked frightened, and perhaps there were traces of recent tears. Alex didn't think that he was the source of the fear. The figure gaped at Alex for a moment, then slowly and quietly stammered, You can see me?" Alex knew right away that this was the voice he had heard the previous night and had thought might be that of his mother. Peetry, he decided, was either a young woman or a teenage boy with a high voice. "Yeah," Alex whispered with a nod, "I can see you." How do you know my name?" the figure asked, its eyes wide and staring, glinting with the pale reflection of the streetlight outside. I was kind of asleep," Alex replied, trying to keep his voice low. "And this, well, not really a voice, but like someone thinking to me, I guess, told me you were here and told me your name. It asked me to come talk to you." Alex, hearing his own words, thought they sounded utterly insane. Yet Peetry was there, just as the non-voice had said he or she would be, and there was no doubt that Peetry was frightened and distraught, just as Alex had been told. Peetry said, how can you see me?" Alex shrugged. "I don't know," he admitted, "but me and my friends could also see these dinosaur dogs and those guys outside yesterday." Peetry stared at Alex, obviously confused, which wasn't surprising. He went on nevertheless, adding, "I also saw that manta ray thing 2 nights ago." Peetry stared at Alex for another moment before saying, "What? Who are you? Who spoke to you?" "I'm Alex Hinton. I don't know really who talked to me, or thought to me, I guess. They said you'd know." The young man or woman still looked frightened and more perplexed than even Alex felt. Alex found himself swelling with empathy and even pity. He couldn't make out clearly what Peetry was wearing, but he got the impression of someone disheveled, dirty, and underfed, as though he or she had been on the run or in hiding for some time. Who are you?" Peetry asked again. "I'm Alex. Look, I don't know what's going on either, but this voice, or whatever, in my dream told me to come down and tell you that everything's okay, that you did a good job, or something like that." A light seemed to dawn in Peetry's eyes, and he, or she, asked, Was it Winestreth?" Alex did not recognize the word, so he simply said, "Huh?" "The tree," Peetry replied. "The tree in the garden of Friend Patamus." Alex didn't recognize the last word, or name, or whatever it was, any more than he had the first strange word that Peetry had said. But on hearing the word tree, an image and memory sprang into his head as if called up by some external force. He saw the garden of his dream from the night before, saw himself standing in that garden, before the small tree that held the place of honor in its center. He recalled greeting the tree, feeling warmth, welcome, and friendship. He remembered his greeting being returned, not in words, but in impressions, in concepts, in thoughts. That was the sort of impression he'd had in his near dream just moments before. He recognized now the same emotional imprint that came with those thoughts, more distinctive than any spoken voice could ever have been. It was the tree. The tree in the garden from last night had spoken to him tonight, had told him to come downstairs and talk to Peetry. "Yes!" he exclaimed, then realized that he had spoken too loudly. He lowered his voice, repeating in a near whisper, "Yes! You mean the tree on that dais, or whatever Simon called it, in the middle of the botanical gardens, right?" Peetry clearly had some difficulty following Alex. He or she looked confused for a moment, but then replied, Yes, I believe so." "Yes," Alex repeated eagerly, reveling in his new understanding. "That's what talked to me." Peetry looked amazed. But how? How can Winestrith speak to you? How can you see me? How can you understand me?" Now Alex was confused again. "What do you mean, how can I understand you?" he asked. "You're speaking English, right?" Peetry shook his or her head. "If English is a language, then no, I'm not speaking it. I'm speaking Mirch, aren't you?" Alex had no idea what Mirch was. It sounded like an exclamation of disgust to him, but he shook his head. "No," he replied, "I'm talking normally, in English." But... Peetry's confusion and distress seemed to be growing. "How can I understand you? How can you understand me? How can you see me?" Alex shrugged and shook his head at the same time. "I don't know," he said. "I don't understand any of this. The tree just told me to..." He stopped talking suddenly because he heard a creaking sound in the ceiling over the living room. He knew right away what caused it. His mother was getting out of bed. Was she just going to use the bathroom, or had she heard him downstairs again? "Crap," he whispered frantically. "My mom is up." Peetry stared at the ceiling in alarm. After looking around in apparent indecision for a moment while the noises upstairs continued, Peetry reached out and gently took Alex by the wrist. "Come with me, please," Peetry whispered, and, pulling Alex along behind, walked carefully but quickly around the dining room table directly toward the left side dining room curtain. "Oh, hey," Alex said, remembering Simon's speculation from yesterday afternoon and resisting Peetry's pull slightly. "Don't worry," Peetry whispered, continuing forward. "Just for a moment, please." Alex didn't have any more time to think, because Peetry had reached the drape and quickly pulled it aside. "Wait," Alex tried to stammer. "It might not..." But Peetry's head was already ducked down and pushing into the wall's non-substance, causing a tremendous riot of ripples to spread through the entire area. Simon, Alex thought for an instant, would surely have been horrified. Then the rest of Peetry followed, stepping over the lower edge of the wall, maintaining a hold on Alex's wrist all the while. Alex, perforce, went through immediately after. He watched his hand and arm follow Peetry's, making far fewer waves than Peetry's did. He felt no substance, no resistance to his flesh, just as had happened before. He did feel a slight tug on his pajamas, as he had felt with his jacket sleeve when it had touched the wall. His clothes seemed to be the source of what relatively minor disturbance he was causing. His body itself seemed to go through the wall without it even recognizing his existence, if a wall could be capable of recognition. As Alex's hand and face approached the surface, he instinctively squeezed his eyes shut and braced for impact with what should have been a hard surface, or alternatively for his head to explode in the vacuum of outer space. Neither of those things happened. Instead, through his closed eyelids, Alex became aware without transition of a much greater level of ambient light than had been present an instant before. This sensation, however, was overwhelmed by a startling realization of being off balance, as if the ground, the world, had suddenly shifted under his feet. He felt himself tilting backwards, though as far as he knew he had not changed his posture. His eyes came open automatically as he instinctively scrambled for equilibrium, but before he could even decide what to do, Peetry pulled him upright, evidently expecting that Alex would find himself tilted. Alex stumbled but was able to keep his footing, largely due to the assistance from Peetry, who now stood before him. It didn't occur to Alex to say even a word of thanks for the help, because he was too busy looking in wonder at his surroundings. He was no longer in his dining room. He was also quite clearly not in outer space. He was instead standing in a small clearing in what appeared to be a wooded grove nestled against a steep, rocky, and all but bare hillside which rose beside and behind him perhaps 30 or 40 feet to a rounded peak. Surrounding the clearing, pressing even against the base of the rocky hill, was a copious profusion of plants. Most were modest trees, mixed with occasional vines, some smaller bushes and brambles. There was also a scattering of tall grass here and there, but the ground at Alex's feet was bare, hard, red-brown dirt. The air smelled clean and clear, the refreshing odors of the plants mixing with an atmosphere untainted by noxious or offensive substances. Alex didn't think he'd ever smelled anything so pure and so healthful. The sky above was an almost uniform reddish-orange, and the few wisps of cloud he saw were faintly tinted purple. The light was not quite as bright as full noontime, but it was certainly far from the night that had surrounded Alex only moments before. Squinting slightly in the sudden illumination, Alex saw that, though individual shades varied, the green in all the leaves and stems of the plants and trees bore a very slight bluish tinge. The only normal vegetation of any kind he saw was a rotting apple lying on the ground near the edge of the clearing, only a few feet from the bottom of the rocky hill. Alex paid little attention to that small incongruity because he was busy noticing a fact that was vastly stranger. All the plants in the area, the grasses, the brambles, the vines, but especially the trees, were aware of him and were greeting him. They were also, he realized, greeting Peetry, who stood near Alex, having released his wrist and looked more obviously overwrought and unhappy in the bright light. "We can talk here for a bit," Peetry told him. "It's safe." Alex was silent for a moment, still taking everything in, and then he asked, This isn't a dream, is it?" Apparently surprised by the question, Peetry replied, "No, I don't think it is." Alex turned in place. Behind him, instead of his dining room, he saw a flat, leaning surface of stone, a leg of the rocky, red-brown hill that dominated the scene. A breeze blew, and in its movement Alex saw on the inclined rock behind him an ovoid pool of rippling waves, the exact size and shape of the one on the wall of his family's dining room. This wavy oval was tilted backwards slightly with the slope of the rock. Was that why he had felt so off balance a moment ago when Peetry had pulled him here? Because the exit, or portal, or whatever, was tilted on this side, but straight up and down on the other? The thought of the other side made him think of his mother. "Holy crap!" he yelled. "My mom's gonna freak out." "No," Peetry said, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder, guessing correctly that he intended to step into the rippling surface of the rock and return to his dining room. "She won't." "Yes, she will," Alex yelled back, turning to face Peetry. "If she comes downstairs and I'm not there, and my room's empty, she sure as heck is gonna freak." Petry's head shook rapidly and desperately. "No, she won't have a chance to. Time is different there than here." Alex stared at Peetry, momentarily distracted from his panic, but far from comprehending. "What do you mean?" he asked. Peetry replied, "I don't really understand it, but because of the chasm, our time flows much more quickly than on where you live. Your mom won't notice that you've gone because you'll be back before she can. Notice, I mean." Alex wasn't entirely sure he understood, but it seemed that Peetry was trying to tell him that when he went back, which he meant to do very soon, his mother wouldn't have had a chance to realize that he had ever been gone. He wished Simon were here to help him understand what was happening. The situation was utterly mind-boggling, but at least it wasn't frightening. Even in the brighter light, Peetry didn't seem in any way threatening, but in fact looked horribly disheveled, wearing a dirty, short-sleeved, dark robe belted at the waist, and that came down to hip-length over loose-fitting, lighter-colored pants. These flapped at their ragged ends over dirty and threadbare slip-on shoes. Every article of clothing Peetry wore was stained and frayed, and Petry's face was soiled as well. In the new light, one fact was clear to Alex. "You're a girl, aren't you?" he asked. Peetry looked confused and shocked. "Yes, of course," she replied. "You sound as though you think I shouldn't be." "Well, the tree, I guess, when it was talking, or whatever, about you. I kept thinking it was saying he and him. Now Petry's face, framed by unkempt, light brown hair of uniform length that wouldn't have reached even a high collar in the back, softened, and she looked ever so slightly amused. "Oh," she said, "I see why you're confused. But plants don't really have separate genders, not like humans and other walkers, so they have a hard time with the concept. Most of them just think of all of us as he or all of us as she." Alex looked at Peetry for a long moment, doubting her sanity. "Plants think of us as he or she?" he asked. "Yes," Peetry affirmed, "especially younger ones. Some of the very old trees figure it out in time, but many don't bother, and Winestreth has much else to worry about." "Plants don't think at all," Alex snapped, on the verge of yelling, and for some reason finding Petry's bizarre claim more disquieting than the fact that he had just been pulled through his dining room wall into someplace completely different than his home. The reality around him was solid and real as far as he could tell, but what Peetry was saying was nuts, and being in a foreign place with a girl who was crazy seemed worse than being there alone. But wait. Hadn't the plants around the clearing just given him a greeting as he'd arrived? They had. Was he crazy too? Peetry, in response to Alex's outburst, shook her head urgently, still looking harried, but at least not quite so alarmed. "No, that's not true," she said. "Winestreth told me that the plants in your world are somehow asleep or not aware, but here on Osmir they certainly do think and communicate." Alex tried to keep up with his own thoughts and with Petry's words at the same time, but was not having much success. He was, however, able to put one thing together based on what Peetry had just said. She had said, "your world," and then had said, "here on Osmir," or something like that. Is this like another planet?" he asked in wonder, barely able to conceive of what he was proposing, let alone understand it. Peetry shrugged dismissively. "It's more than that," she said, "but I don't understand it very well. And we don't have time. You said that Winestreth had sent you to talk to me?" Trying to sort out his overwhelmed thoughts, of being on another planet, of his mother waking up and finding him gone, of plants being able to think and communicate but not quite getting the idea of human genders, Alex said, yeah, that's right. It told me to tell you that what happened was what it wanted to happen, or something like that." Petry's expression made it clear that she didn't understand Alex's message any more than he did himself. She looked as frazzled and upset as before. Alex thought she was in much worse shape than he was, even though she must know a lot more about what was going on. But what happened?" Peetry asked. Her anxiety seemed to be resurging. "I don't know," Alex admitted. "I mean, a lot of stuff happened, but I don't know what the tree was talking about." Hearing himself say the words tree and talking in the same sentence, Alex could barely believe his own voice and ears, but he certainly couldn't deny anything based on the evidence of his senses. "But," Peetry said, "what happened to the berries? I put them in the bowl on the table." She looked far more upset than Alex felt, more upset than even Simon had looked after first recognizing that he, Alex, and Megan had shared the same dream. She sounded on the verge of hysteria. Alex, however, was too stunned by Petry's revelation to dwell on her mental state much. "You put those there?" he asked. "Yes," Peetry cried desperately. "I had to hide them somewhere. They were all after me, and though the plants here help protect me, I don't think even they could hide the scent of Winestreth's berries from the Tixons forever. I went to your world to hide them. I'm the only one who knows about this shunt." Peetry pointed to the rock behind Alex as she said this, but Alex wasn't able to think about what she meant because her words kept tumbling over one another at breakneck pace. "And I saw the memorial bowl on the table, and I thought it would be a good place to hide the berries until a better time, like Winestreth asked me to do, and because of the time difference, I'd be able to come back before long. In your world, I mean. But when I came back a month ago, I didn't see them. Then I heard something coming before I could really look for them, and I got frightened, so I ran back here. And the plants told me I should wait until it's nighttime again in your world. It was so long. But I waited, then I went back and I looked, but I still couldn't find them. They're gone. They're still gone. What's happened to them?" Peetry looked on the verge of tears, and Alex felt hesitant about answering her desperate questions. He started, muttering. "Well, me and my friends, Simon and Megan, we ate them. Peetry's mouth dropped agape and her eyes opened even wider than before. For a moment she stood absolutely still, staring straight ahead. Then, much to Alex's alarm, her strength appeared to give out, and she half sat, half fell down to the bare ground, landing in a seated position with her legs splayed out in front of her. The impact with the ground must have hurt, but Peetry seemed not to notice that she was no longer standing. She brought her hands to the sides of her head, just as they had been when Alex had first caught sight of her a few minutes ago. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice somehow more frightening than a shriek would have been. "What have I done? I've doomed us all, the world, the universe." Alex was frightened not by Peetry's words, but by her aspect of horrified despair. He didn't think she could be more than 4 or 5 years older than he was, but she seemed to have been aged beyond her years by an overwhelming fear and burden. He almost thought that he could literally feel her distress. Actually, now that he paid attention, he realized that he could feel her distress, just a little. It slowly penetrated his being as though seeping through his skin. It didn't quite make him share her emotions, which would have left him as overwhelmed as she. Rather, he wanted to ease her anguish somehow, because he knew how much she suffered. He realized that he could also feel something more than just Peetry's distress. He felt a collection of urges from all around him, and it only took a moment to identify them as the same chorus of thoughts that had greeted him when he first came into the clearing. It was the plants. They were trying to get his attention, and now that they had it, Alex began to make out the ideas of words, much as he had in his half-dream from before. "Tell him," they said, almost as one voice, though there were dozens or even hundreds of minds speaking. "Tell him what Winnestrith said. He suffers so much." The actual word Winnestrith was not used, but rather an image and impression were shared, which instantly conveyed the identity of the tree from the garden, the tree that had spoken to Alex while he slept. Alex was astounded and delighted to realize that the plants around the clearing were truly talking to him now. He had no time to revel in that wonderful experience, however, because they were right. They might have trouble recognizing that Peetry was not a he, but they clearly felt, just as Alex did, that Peetry was barely holding herself together. "Hey," he said, going over to the girl and putting a tentative hand on her shoulder. "Take it easy." Under the material of the robe, Alex felt that there was hardly any flesh on Peetry's bones. Perhaps she was naturally thin. He guessed she was, though he couldn't be sure. But she had clearly not been eating as much as she ought to have been for some time. Peetry didn't draw back from Alex's touch, and she didn't take her hands away from the side of her head as she raised her face to look at him. Alex wondered if she had even the slightest idea who he was at the moment. Still, he had to try to get the message across, and he found that, for some reason, he could remember it clearly. He thought that might be at least partly due to the encouragement he was getting from the plants around him. He could even remember the name Peetry had given for the tree. "Winnestrith," he said, "wanted me to tell you that all is well. It said to tell you what had happened, and to tell you it is what I hoped would happen." Peetry did not take her hands away from her temples, but her face might have relaxed ever so slightly. "Winnestrith told you that?" she said. "Yes," Alex replied fervently. "I was asleep and kind of half dreaming, and I heard, well, not really heard, but anyway, it was talking to me. I didn't know what it was, but it told me that someone was upset and scared, and could I please go to him and tell him what had happened, and that it, Winnestrith I mean, had wanted it to happen. I didn't know what it meant, but it told me to go downstairs. It knew you were downstairs in my house." Peetry slowly took her hands away from her head, still gaping at Alex, who had taken his own hand from her shoulder while gesturing to accompany his words. "How?" she asked. "How could Winnestrith know so much and speak to you, even in your own world?" "How the heck should I know?" Alex shot back. "I don't know what's going on at all, where we are, or why any of this is happening. I don't know who you are, except your name, and I don't know who Winnestrith is, except that it's a tree in the middle of that garden place. I don't know what the frack is going on." Alex's mild rant seemed to distract Peetry from her own troubles more effectively than sympathy had. Or perhaps the relayed message from the tree was finally penetrating the haze of fear and despair in her own mind. In any case, she looked briefly away from Alex and down at the ground. "Of course," she said. "How could you know? How could anyone in your world know?" She shook her head and muttered, "I wish I could speak to Enestrith again myself." "Why can't you?" Alex asked. "It's too far," Peetry replied, glancing back at him. Her face was far from calm, but at least she no longer seemed to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "If it were to speak to me over such a long distance, the Gaustron would be able to find me." As she said that strange word, she looked up at the reddish sky. "Oh, okay," Alex said, despite not having any idea what Peetry was talking about. "But it's talked to you before, right? Like it talked to me?" "Of course," Peetry told him with a nod, as if he had asked a silly, if not completely stupid, question. "I was one of the gardeners at Friend Patamus. I've always loved the plants, and I've always gotten along with them. Far better than I do with people. And, well, many of them seem to like me as well." As she spoke these last words, Peetry looked around shyly, blushing slightly. At first, Alex didn't understand the expression or her glance, but then he felt a warm, affectionate response from the flora all around, and he realized that the plants were, in a way, almost smiling, as though amused but charmed by Peetry's humility. It was crazy. He was hearing what plants were thinking. Well, not hearing exactly, that wasn't the right word at all, but he didn't know what the right word was. In any case, the true point of his wonderment was at how plants could be thinking in the first place. That they were thinking he didn't doubt any longer. He was as viscerally certain of that fact as he was of gravity. It was an understanding more fundamental and primary than knowledge. He knew it like he knew that his legs were attached to his body. Peetry looked back at Alex again, and now her face was noticeably calmer, but it did bear a look of curiosity. "You," she began, "they like you too. You know them." "Huh?" Alex said. "The plants," Peetry said in a voice of amazement, waving her left arm at their surroundings. "They like you." "Oh," Alex said. "Okay. Well, thanks. I like them too. They seem nice." He felt absurd saying such a thing aloud, but it was true. "But how?" Peetry asked again. "How can you be so... This isn't your world." Alex, looking around at the vibrant blue greenery and at the red-tinted sky and smelling the fresh, invigorating air, said, "Yeah, I know." "Yet," Peetry went on, "Enestrith spoke to you, across the chasm in your world, and you understood. How?" "Look, you gotta stop asking me that," Alex replied with some asperity. "I don't have a clue. Me and Simon and Megan have just been having these weird dreams and seeing and hearing weird things for the past couple of days, starting with those berries." At the mention of the berries, Peetry's face drew up in a worried frown, though one not quite so alarming as before. In a dumbfounded tone, she asked him, You really ate them? The berries? All of them?" "Yeah," Alex said. "Me and Simon and Megan ate them." He felt strangely guilty in the face of Peetry's shock and disbelief, though he could hardly see that he had done anything wrong. "And," Peetry went on, "Enestrith, it really wanted that to happen?" "I guess so," Alex answered. "At least that's what it said. I guess it could be lying." That wasn't the case, though. He didn't think the non-voice would have been able to communicate a dishonest sentiment without him knowing. "But look," he went on, "that's all I know. I don't understand any of this. I don't know where I am. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what the deal is with the garden or the flying manta rays or the dinosaur dogs or that tree and those berries. I mean, what the heck is going on?" Now that Peetry seemed to be calming down, Alex found his own stress level rising. The tree had asked him to go and reassure Peetry, to tell her that everything was okay, but who was looking out for him? Who was going to tell him that everything was okay? He had just been pulled through an apparent space warp in his dining room wall into another world where plants could think and even communicate, and it looked like the world he dreamed about the last 2 nights. He had only Peetry's word that his mother wasn't even now running through the house in a terrified panic, wondering where her son had gone. Peetry looked at Alex levelly for a moment, then stood back up, absently brushing off the seat of her pants. "I don't really know what to tell you," she said, and Alex thought her tone was more honestly confused than dismissive. I don't understand very much myself. I don't understand the things that are happening to you. No one from your world has ever been able to see anyone from Osmere before, as far as I know. And we shouldn't be able to understand each other. I don't speak your language. No one from Osmere does, and..." Her voice tapered off, and she suddenly looked all around, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the greenery around her. "The plants," she murmured. "It must be the plants." She turned back quickly, looking at Alex with an expression that was almost happy for the first time since he had been with her. "That must be it," she exclaimed. "You can understand the plants, and they're bridging the gap in our languages. It's said that it was the plants long ago who united all the other thinking creatures of the world. Maybe the berries, Wenestrith." Alex shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I don't know why me and my friends can see the things we see or anything. I mean, what's the big deal with the berries anyway? Why were you so freaked out about them?" Peetry blinked at Alex a few times before responding. "Don't you know?" she asked. "Didn't Wenestrith tell you?" "No!" Alex shouted. "I don't know anything. I told you everything that the tree told me. That it was okay, that you did a good job, that whatever happened was what it wanted to happen. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what the deal is with the berries or the tree or how any of this is happening." He felt bad about yelling at Peetry, who frankly didn't seem to know much more than he did, but he had been dealing with this upheaval in his reality for more than 2 days, and it was getting to him. If Simon and Megan hadn't both experienced the same such strange things, he would have been sure that he was insane. Yet he had been the one asked, by a tree no less, to go reassure this girl who was years older than he was and who was walking around in his house at night. Peetry's eyebrows contracted, and she appeared to sympathize. "I'm very sorry," she said. "I only understand a little of this myself, but I know that the garden, and especially Wenestrith, have been specially grown over the course of the last 1,000 years to strengthen the chasm and stop the collision, and the berries were the final product of that attempt. But Wenestrith told me to take the berries, that there were people who wanted to do something bad with them. It told me to hide them. It told me how to come here, and it told me about this shunt. No one expected anyone to take the berries, so when Wenestrith gave them to me, I was able to get away easily. But once they found out, they followed me. The Gaustrin, and especially the Tixons, are able to smell the berries easily. So even though this grove is protected, I didn't think it was safe enough. I panicked. I went through the shunt and put the berries in the ceremonial bowl because, well, it seemed like as good a place as any, and I didn't think people in your world would be able to see them. Then I came back, and for almost 2 months I've been hiding and waiting for the followers to lose interest. But they haven't. Of course they haven't. And when I went back to check on the berries almost a month ago, well, I heard someone coming and I had to leave before I really had a chance to look. Then today... Wait, Alex interrupted. You said you put the berries in the bowl a couple of months ago? Yes, Peetry replied. But the berries were only there like 2 days ago when we ate them. Yes, Peetry repeated. Like I said, time is different in your world. It runs faster here. How could that happen? Alex asked, focusing on the time issue because it, at least, was something that had meaning to him, unlike pretty much everything else Peetry had said. I don't know, Peetry admitted, looking embarrassed. I'm sorry, but I don't really understand it either. Man, Alex muttered, I wish Simon was here. He might at least have some clue about what you're talking about. Peetry looked unhappy about Alex's confession that he didn't understand. Well, I'll try to explain things better if I can. What did you have a question about? Alex didn't really know where to begin. Peetry had already admitted that she didn't understand the time issue, so asking more questions about that wasn't going to help. As for everything else in her brief rundown of how she came to be where she was now, it was all just a stream of gobbledygook. He didn't know where to start. But he needed to try to figure out something, at least, so he focused on a word Peetry had spoken which reminded him of his dream from 2 nights ago. "You said something about a chasm," he began. Do you mean this really huge cliff that, goes on for as far as you can see and doesn't have any other side to it?" Peetry nodded, her eyes widening and her face brightening. "Yes," she said, obviously pleased. And does it have this, like this building or city or something that's just hanging over the edge? Like it's just floating there?" "Yes," Peetry exclaimed with great enthusiasm. "That's Burdock Tamas. I live there. I used to live there." Her face fell, and Alex thought he could imagine why. She certainly didn't look like she'd been living comfortably for quite some time, given the state of her clothes. He thought it was a wonder that she didn't smell bad, but perhaps she had some place where she could take a bath. Maybe there was a lake or a river somewhere in the vicinity. After all, so many plants in one area should mean that there was plenty of water. He didn't even need Simon to point that out for him. He wanted to ask Peetry how she survived here by herself, and for months, according to what she had told him. However, even as he opened his mouth, another sound interrupted him. It was not nearby, not as near as it had been when he had heard it once before, but it did crescendo as it went along, which seemed to imply that it was coming closer. It was the croaking shriek of the manta-ray creature that had flown over his house just after his dream 2 nights ago. "Oh, crap," he whispered, looking up at the ruddy sky. He saw no sign of the improbable flying shape, but as its shriek died down, he felt sure it was getting nearer, and this time he was in the open, in more or less broad daylight. He looked around desperately, thinking of making a dash for the undergrowth. "It's a Gaustrin!" Peetry yelled, looking as alarmed as Alex felt. She too glanced at the sky, then looked back at Alex. "You have to go back through the shunt." It took Alex an instant to remember that Peetry was referring to the rippling space warp thing when she said shunt, but once he did, he thought it was a very good idea. "Yeah, you're right," he said breathlessly. "Come on." He waved at Peetry to follow him as he turned back toward the rock surface from which they'd emerged after leaving his dining room. Another shriek began, this one ever so slightly louder than the previous one had been. "No," Peetry replied, much to Alex's surprise. "You go through. You said that your mother was awake. I can't be in your house." Alex gaped. He couldn't believe that Peetry was worried about such a thing when a flying monster was getting closer by the second. "Are you crazy?" he asked. "You can't just stay here and let that thing find you." Peetry's reaction had confirmed Alex's already strong suspicion that the flying manta ray was dangerous. "Don't worry," Peetry assured him, sounding desperate. "The plants here hide and protect me. I'll be fine. But your alien presence may stand out. You have to go back." A new shriek sounded. "Are you sure?" Alex asked, hoping wildly that Peetry wasn't just saying that she'd be safe to convince him to go without her. True, he had only just met her, and she was by no means a comfortable presence, but he didn't want just to leave her and let her be torn apart by some monster out of what should have been a nightmare. "Yes," Peetry insisted. "I'll be fine. Go." Alex was convinced by her tone and her expression. He turned and started to move into the surface of the rock, where he could still make out slight ripples in the oval surface. As he approached it, he noticed that there were actual scratches on the rock surface and that they seemed to delineate the edges of the shunt. He had barely begun to take a step when Peetry's hand grabbed his shoulder and brought him to a halt. "What?" he snapped at her, glancing at the sky. "Go through head first," she told him, pointing at the rock. "Otherwise the change in gravity will make you fall backward and you'll just come right back out." Alex blinked for a moment, uncomprehending. Then another shriek split the air, this one definitely closer. "Go!" Peetry shouted, and she half prodded, half shoved Alex forward. He lost his balance and fell face first toward the rock. He put his hands out instinctively to keep himself from smashing head first into what ought to have been a hard surface, but all he felt was the back of the dining room curtains as his hands passed effortlessly through the rippling oval in the stone. The rest of him followed, and he again experienced that bizarre sensation of having different parts of his body feel different directional pulls of gravity, as his front end was pulled more directly down than his legs were. He found himself now in the darkness of the dining room, which seemed much darker to him than it had before, after the daylight in the clearing. He felt more than saw the fluttering of the drape as it was pushed aside by his hands. He had time to be thankful that he hadn't just yanked the whole curtain down before his head clipped into the side of the dining room table when the rest of him made its way through the wall, and the pull of gravity threw him completely off balance. "Ow!" he yelled, falling to his knees and putting both hands to his forehead. That had hurt. The dining room table was surprisingly sturdy, and bumping his head into its edge was enough to make him forget, for an instant, what had just happened to him. "Alex?" He heard his mother's voice call over his repeated mutterings of "ow, ow, 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 ow." Looking up, Alex was briefly blinded when the dining room light came on. His mother came around the side of the table, looking concerned and just a bit frightened. "What are you doing?" she asked as she knelt down beside him. "Are you all right?" Alex looked dazedly up at his mother's face. She looked disheveled from bed, and she certainly seemed concerned, but her face bore no trace of real fear, let alone panic, such as she might have felt if she had been looking for him for several minutes while he had been wherever it was that he had been. "Mom," he said, still holding his head. "Of course it's me, sweetie," she said. "What happened?" "I hit my head," Alex replied. "Let me see," his mother commanded, taking his hands away from his mildly throbbing skull. She looked at him closely for a moment, then said, "Well, it doesn't look too bad, but I think you'll have a bit of a bump. Do you want some ice?" Alex shook his head, almost unable to believe how calm his mother was. "Okay," she said, rising to her feet and helping Alex to his. He was worried for a moment that he was going to be unsteady, but he felt perfectly fine, apart from a slight tremulousness, born from the adrenaline flood that had accompanied the croaking howls of the flying manta ray. "Were you sleepwalking?" his mother asked him. I don't know," Alex answered, and a tiny part of him wondered if he had been. Could he have dreamed his whole encounter with Peetry and his trip to the grove and clearing on the other side of the dining room wall? His mother smiled and gave a light chuckle, saying, "Well, they say it does happen to kids your age, but you need to be more careful even in your sleep if that's possible. You've only got one head and it's got to last your whole life." Alex gaped at her. He still couldn't believe it. His mother wasn't alarmed at all. As far as he could tell, she had never even noticed that he'd been gone. Yet he and Peetry had talked for several minutes at least after they had heard the sounds of her movement from upstairs and after Peetry had pulled him through the dining room wall. Time really was different in that other world than it was here in Alex's. Either that or he really had been dreaming, but he didn't think he had. Even his two previous, extremely vivid dreams of Peetry's world had not approached the solidity of presence that he had just experienced. In fact, the real world around him now seemed less palpable and intense than had the clearing and the plant life around it, to say nothing of the terrifying call of the flying manta ray. No, he was pretty sure it had all been real as anything he'd experienced in his life, and scarier than most. Well, it had been scary at the end. Peetry wasn't scary at all. She had been almost as lost and confused as he, and certainly had not been threatening in any way. And the plants had been wonderful. He had never before felt anything like what he'd felt from them, the sense of greeting and warmth they had conveyed. His mother walked with him upstairs as he pondered what he had just gone through. He was glad she didn't ask him any questions, because he didn't want to have to lie to her, but he certainly couldn't tell her the truth. She guided him to his bed and watched as he got under his covers. Then she briefly turned on his light so she could take another look at his forehead and into his eyes. After a moment she said, "You look fine. It won't even be a very big lump, I think." "Yeah," Alex agreed. His forehead barely hurt at all now. "It's no big deal." "Okay," his mother said. "Good." Then she stood back up and went to his door, turning as she reached it and saying, "If this keeps up, though, I'm going to have to start bolting your door from the outside so you don't fall down the stairs one of these nights." She smiled as she said it, but Alex could detect an undercurrent of real concern in her voice. He laughed weakly and said, "Yeah, that might be a good idea." Smiling more broadly, his mother said, "You try and go back to sleep, and try to stay in bed if you can." "I will, Mom," Alex agreed. His mother left, shutting off the light and closing the door behind her. As Alex lay in his darkened room, he feared that sleep would elude him for some time. He glanced at his alarm clock and saw that it was just past midnight, so if he did succeed in dropping off, he would at least be reasonably well rested when he got up in the morning. But for the moment his thoughts were in turmoil, and he struggled to make at least some sense of them. One thing was certain now. The dreams and the strange things that he, Simon, and Megan had seen were all connected, as was the space warp, the shunt as Peetry had called it. Also, Simon had been right that the berries were connected too, though Alex didn't understand what they really were or why they were so important. Why had the tree, Winestrith, wanted Peetry to take them and hide them? Why had Peetry been so upset when she'd heard that the berries had been eaten, even though that was really what you were supposed to do with berries? He so wished that he could have had the chance to talk to Peetry some more. He even considered going back downstairs and going through the wall again to see if she was still there, but then he thought of the shrieking, croaking call of the flying manta ray and decided he'd better not. Peetry had said that his alien presence might make him stick out and be easy to find, and he most definitely did not want to meet that thing up close. There had been times over the past few days that Alex really wondered if he might be losing his mind. Now, even though things had gotten steadily stranger since the first dream, he found himself more and more certain of the reality of what was happening. This was partly because Simon and Megan had also had the dreams, and had seen the dinosaur dogs and the rippling in his dining room wall. If he had been the only one going through it all, he would have been much more concerned and vastly more frightened. He wondered whether Simon and Megan had experienced anything strange that night. Had they too heard the tree speaking to them? Had they shared a dream while he was awake and in Peetry's world? What would they think when he told them about going through the shunt? He didn't have any idea how Megan would react, but he suspected that Simon's first reaction would be gaping horror. Alex smiled to himself as he imagined starting a conversation with Simon by saying, "I went through that thing in the wall last night." He could picture his friend's expression, aghast, his eyes wide and mouth hanging open. It would be funny in a way, but it would also be unkind, so he had no intention of introducing the subject like that. Still, he was going to have to tell Simon and Megan what had happened, and to ask their thoughts and whether anything had happened to them. His eyes were now adjusting to the dark of his room again, and he could make out clearly the familiar shapes of his surroundings. He thought about getting up and opening his curtains, since he knew that the manta thing was in Peetry's world, and he'd like to look at the stars if they were out. Then it occurred to him that there was most likely more than one of the flying things. There had certainly been more than one dinosaur dog. He decided against stargazing. One of those manta rays might just still be out there, looking for him, ready to make its shrieking call at any time. It occurred to Alex that it wasn't very smart of a hunting creature to make all those noises. It gave itself away, allowing anyone down below the time to look for a hiding place. He wondered why it did such a thing. He also wondered why, in addition to sounding extremely dangerous, he thought the creature sounded sad and in pain. Such thoughts troubled him, but nevertheless he drifted off to sleep before much time had passed. He didn't hear the voice of the tree, Winestrith, again that night, and he didn't have any more dreams of Peetry's world.